The idea first came to us on one of those nights when sleep feels impossible. My wife, Emma, and I were lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the darkness of the room mirroring the growing sense of dread in our hearts. It had been weeks since Eva's behavior began to change, and no matter how much we tried to coax it out of her, she remained tight-lipped, her eyes filled with a fear that neither of us could understand. "I just don't know what else to do," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "She's not herself anymore, and it's like she's afraid of something, but she won't tell us what." I reached over, taking her hand in mine. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady even as the same fear gnawed at me. "I've noticed it too. She used to love going to kindergarten, but now—" I trailed off, not wanting to voice the unthinkable. Emma turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine for answers that I didn't have. What if we put a recorder in her toy? I know it's not ideal, but maybe we'll hear something that could explain what's happening." I hesitated, the idea feeling both invasive and necessary. "You mean like in her bunny?" I asked, picturing the worn, well-loved stuffed animal that Ava took everywhere with her. Emma nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. "Yes, it's small enough to hide the recorder, and she won't suspect anything. I need to know what's going on when we're not there." I sighed, knowing deep down that she was right. As much as I hated the thought of spying on our own daughter, the alternative, remaining in the dark while she suffered, was even worse. "Okay," I agreed, my voice heavy with reluctance. "We'll do it. But only until we figure out what's happening. Then we'll confront the school and put a stop to it." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I just want her to be happy again." The next morning, while Ava was busy brushing her teeth, I carefully inserted the tiny dictaphone into the back of her stuffed bunny, making sure it was well hidden but still able to pick up sound. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, a mix of guilt and determination fueling my movements. When Ava came back into her room, she smiled at the sight of her bunny, completely unaware of the small device now hidden inside. "Daddy, can Bunny come to school with me today?" she asked, her voice filled with that innocent hope that always made my heart swell. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, forcing a smile as I handed the toy back to her. "Bunny can go with you wherever you want." She hugged the toy tightly, her little face lighting up with happiness. "Thank you, Daddy." As we drove to kindergarten, Ava chatted away in the backseat, her excitement about the day's activities momentarily easing the tension that had been building inside me. I glanced at Emma, who gave me a small, reassuring smile. For a brief moment, it almost felt like everything was normal again. When we arrived at the kindergarten, I walked Ava to the door, kneeling down to give her a hug before she went inside. "You be good today, okay?" I said, my voice catching slightly. "I will, Daddy," she promised, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck. "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered, holding her close for just a second longer. "Have a good day." As I watched her skip inside, clutching her bunny, a knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. I hoped, prayed, that we were doing the right thing. Later that evening, after we put Eva to bed, Emma and I sat together on the couch, the dictaphone in my hand. My heart pounded as I pressed play, the room filling with the sound of our daughter's voice. "Good morning, Bunny." Ava's cheerful voice rang out, her words filled with the innocent joy we'd come to cherish. "Today's going to be a good day, right?" Emma and I exchanged a glance, our hearts aching at the sound of her optimism. But as the recording continued, the mood shifted. We could hear the voices of other children, the sounds of chairs scraping and papers rustling as the day began. And then there was the voice we hadn't expected. "Eva, stop dawdling and get in line. You're always so slow. Why can't you be like the other children?" The voice was sharp, almost cruel, and unmistakably that of Miss Campbell. Emma gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as we listened to our daughter's small, fearful reply. "Yes, Miss Campbell," Ava whispered, her tone filled with dread. I could feel the anger rising within me, my hands clenching into fists as the recording continued. Miss Campbell's voice was cold, devoid of any warmth or kindness, and the way she spoke to Ava was enough to make my blood boil. "What's wrong with her?" Emma whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "How could she talk to Ava like that?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice tight with anger. but we're going to find out. We can't let this continue." We listened to the rest of the recording in silence, each harsh word from Miss Campbell cutting deeper into our hearts. By the time it ended, Emma was crying openly, and I was seething with a mix of fury and helplessness. "We have to do something," Emma said through her tears, her voice trembling. "We can't let her keep hurting Eva like this." I nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "We will," I promised, my voice firm with resolve. "We'll get to the bottom of this, and we'll make sure she never hurts our little girl again." As I held Emma close, trying to comfort her, my mind raced with thoughts of how to confront the situation. Whatever it took, I was going to protect my daughter. I just hoped we weren't too late. The next morning, as I helped Eva into her coat, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. The recording from the previous night played on a loop in my mind, each sharp word from Miss Campbell cutting through my thoughts like a knife. I watched as Eva tied her shoes, her small hands fumbling with the laces in her usual careful way. "Are you ready for school, sweetie?" I asked, forcing a smile to my face. Eva looked up at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, clutching her bunny close to her chest. "Yes, Daddy," she whispered, though her voice lacked the enthusiasm it once had. I knelt down to her level, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "If anything happens today that makes you feel bad, you can always tell Mommy and Daddy, okay? We're here to help you." She nodded again, but her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Okay, Daddy." As we drove to kindergarten, the silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional murmur from Eva to her bunny. When we arrived, I parked the car and turned to face her, my heart aching at the sight of her small form, so vulnerable and quiet. "You have a good day, all right?" I said, trying to inject some cheerfulness into my voice. "Bunny will be with you the whole time." Eva nodded, giving me a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be good, Daddy, I promise." I wanted to say more, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I walked her to the door and gave her a tight hug, wishing I could stay by her side to protect her from whatever was waiting inside. When I picked Eva up that afternoon, the change in her was more apparent than ever. Her usually bright eyes were downcast, her shoulders slumped as she trudged out of the building, clutching her bunny with both hands. It was as if the life had been drained out of her, leaving behind only a shell of the joyful little girl I once knew. "How was your day, sweetie?" I asked gently, hoping to coax something, anything, out of her. Eva hesitated, glancing up at me with a fleeting look of fear before quickly looking away. "It was okay," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. My heart clenched at the sight of her, and I knelt down beside her, lifting her chin so she would look at me. "Eva, you can tell me if something's wrong. You know that, right?" She nodded, but her eyes filled with tears as she hugged her bunny tighter. "I'm fine, Daddy," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I didn't press her any further. Instead, I wrapped my arms around her and held her close, feeling the weight of her small body against mine. "I love you, sweetheart," I murmured, kissing the top of her head. "You're safe now." That night, after tucking Eva into bed, Emma and I sat down in the living room, the dictaphone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. We exchanged a worried glance before I pressed play, the tension between us thick as we waited to hear what the day had brought. The recording began with the usual sounds of children chattering and laughing, the innocent chaos of a kindergarten classroom. But soon, the atmosphere shifted as Miss Campbell's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Eva, stop fidgeting and pay attention," she snapped, her tone filled with irritation. "You're holding up the entire class." I could almost see Eva's small form freezing in place, her hands tightening around her bunny as she struggled to comply. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Miss Campbell." But Miss Campbell wasn't finished. "Sorry isn't good enough, Eva. You need to try harder. Why can't you be like the other children? They don't need to be told twice." Emma inhaled sharply, her hand gripping mine as we listened. I could hear the quiver in Eva's voice as she responded, her words tinged with fear. "I'll try, Miss Campbell." There was a pause, and then the sound of footsteps as Miss Campbell moved closer to Eva. "Trying isn't enough," she said, her voice lower now but still dripping with cold disdain. "You need to do better, or you'll never amount to anything. Do you understand?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of Ava's shaky breath. "Yes, Miss Campbell," she finally replied, her voice so small and defeated that it made my chest ache. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and I could feel the anger rising within me, a burning need to protect my daughter from this woman who seemed determined to crush her spirit. I wanted to storm into that classroom to demand answers, but I knew we needed more before we could confront the school. We needed to be certain. As the recording continued, we heard more of the same. Miss Campbell's harsh words, her relentless criticism, all directed at Eva. It was as if she had singled our daughter out for some reason, making her the target of her cruelty while the other children went about their day unaffected. When the recording finally ended, Emma and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of what we'd just heard pressing down on us. My hands were clenched into fists, my knuckles white with the effort to contain my anger. "I can't believe this," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and sorrow. "How can she be so cruel to our little girl? What did Ava ever do to deserve this?" "Nothing," I replied, my voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "Ava didn't do anything wrong. This isn't her fault. It's that woman. Something's not right with her." Emma wiped away a tear, her face pale as she looked at me. "What are we going to do? We can't just let this continue." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "We'll keep recording. We need more evidence before we go to the school. And then, we're going to make sure they understand exactly what's been happening to our daughter." Emma nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. Do you think she's doing this to the other children too?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know, but we're going to find out. And if she is, we'll make sure she's held accountable for every single one of them." That night, as I lay in bed beside Emma, I couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. I thought about the way Miss Campbell had spoken to Eva, the way our daughter had shrunk under the weight of her cruelty. And I thought about the way Eva's eyes had filled with tears when I asked her if something was wrong, the fear that had flashed across her face before she quickly buried it. I knew we had to act, but the thought of confronting Miss Campbell filled me with a sense of dread. There was something about her voice, something familiar that I couldn't quite place. And as much as I wanted to protect Eva, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more complicated problem. For now, all I could do was hold on to the knowledge that we were doing everything we could to keep Ava safe. But in the back of my mind, a question lingered, gnawing at me with increasing urgency. Why had Miss Campbell singled out our daughter? And what were we going to do about it when we finally found out? The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and quiet determination. Every morning, I watched Eva shuffle into kindergarten with her bunny clutched tightly in her small hands, her once bright eyes now clouded with a fear that no child should ever have to feel. Every evening, Emma and I would listen to the recordings, our hearts breaking a little more with each new discovery. Miss Campbell's cruelty was relentless, and each recording seemed to reveal a fresh wound inflicted on our daughter's fragile spirit. The way she spoke to Eva, cold, cutting, and utterly devoid of kindness, made my blood boil. Yet despite the growing evidence, confronting the school seemed more daunting with each passing day. The thought of facing Miss Campbell, of trying to understand why she had targeted Eva, filled me with a mixture of anger and dread. One evening, after another exhausting day, Emma and I sat together in the living room, the latest recording in hand. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The tension between us was palpable, an unspoken understanding that whatever we were about to hear could shatter the last vestiges of our daughter's innocence. "Are you ready?" I asked quietly, my thumb hovering over the play button. Emma nodded, her face pale and drawn. "Let's get it over with," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I pressed play, the familiar sounds of the kindergarten classroom filling the room. At first, it was the usual background noise, children talking, chairs scraping, the rustling of papers. And then, Miss Campbell's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Eva, why are you always such a mess?" She sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. "Can't you do anything right?" I could hear the tremor in Eva's voice as she replied, her words tinged with fear. "I'm sorry, Miss Campbell. I didn't mean to." "Sorry doesn't cut it," Miss Campbell interrupted, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You're a disappointment, Eva. If you can't even follow simple instructions, how do you expect to succeed in anything? Emma's hand tightened around mine, her knuckles white as she struggled to hold back tears. I could feel the anger rising within me, a hot, seething fury that made my hands shake. "I'm trying, Miss Campbell," Ava whispered, her voice breaking. "I really am." But Miss Campbell wasn't finished. "Trying isn't good enough," she hissed. "You're always holding the class back. Do you know what the other children think of you, Ava? They think you're weak. They think you're nothing." The recording went silent for a moment, and I could almost see Ava standing there, her little face crumpling as the weight of Miss Campbell's words crashed down on her. The silence was broken by the sound of Ava's soft sobs, each one like a dagger to my heart. "Stop crying," Miss Campbell snapped, her voice filled with disgust. "Crying won't solve anything. It just proves how weak you are." I couldn't listen any longer. My hand shut out, stopping the recording mid-sentence. The room was plunged into an unbearable silence, the echoes of Miss Campbell's cruelty still ringing in our ears. Emma finally broke down, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands. How could she say those things to Eva? She sobbed, her voice filled with anguish. "Our little girl, she doesn't deserve this. No child does." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as I tried to keep my own emotions in check. But the anger was overwhelming, a burning need to protect Ava from the monster who had been slowly destroying her sense of self-worth. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But we can't let this go on any longer. We have to do something." Emma pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face filled with determination. "We need to go to the school," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to show them what she's been doing to Eva. They have to stop her." I nodded, though the thought of confronting Miss Campbell still filled me with dread. "We will," I promised. "But we need to be prepared. We need to have all the recordings, all the evidence, so they can't ignore us." Emma wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to compose herself. "You're right," she agreed. "But what if? What if they don't believe us? What if they try to protect her?" The fear in her voice was palpable, and I understood exactly where she was coming from. The thought of being dismissed, of having our concerns brushed aside, was almost as terrifying as the thought of confronting Miss Campbell herself. "They can't ignore this," I said firmly, though my own doubts gnawed at me. "We'll make them listen. We won't let them sweep this under the rug." As we sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of our decision pressing down on us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Confronting the school was one thing, but understanding why Miss Campbell had targeted our daughter was another entirely. There was something more to this, something that went beyond mere cruelty. And as much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Miss Campbell's motives were deeply personal. The next day, as we prepared to face the school administration, I couldn't help but think back to the time I had spent in kindergarten myself. The memories were distant, faded with time, but one thing stood out: Miss Campbell. She had been a new teacher back then, strict but fair, with a reputation for maintaining order in her classroom. But there had been something else, something I hadn't understood as a child but could see clearly now. It was the way she had looked at me, the way her eyes had narrowed whenever I made a mistake, the way her lips had thinned into a tight line of disapproval. She had never been openly cruel, not in the way she was with Ava, but there had been a coldness, a distance that I hadn't been able to comprehend at the time. Could that be it? Could this be some twisted form of revenge? But for what? I hadn't even realized that she was still teaching, let alone that she would one day be responsible for my daughter's well-being. The idea that this was personal, that Miss Campbell had singled out Ava because of some unresolved issue from my own past, was almost too much to bear. As we drove to the school, Emma's hand resting in mine, I couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. Whatever Miss Campbell's reasons, it was up to us to protect Eva, to shield her from the pain that had been inflicted upon her. And as we walked into the school, the familiar scent of chalk and paper filling the air, I knew that we were about to face a battle that would change our lives forever. The principal's office was just as I remembered it, spacious, with large windows that let in the morning light. The secretary smiled at us as we entered, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "How can I help you today?" "We need to speak with the principal," I replied, my voice steady but firm. It's about our daughter, Eva." The secretary's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and picked up the phone, her voice low as she spoke to the principal. A few moments later, she gestured for us to take a seat. "The principal will see you now." As we stepped into the principal's office, my heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment we had been dreading, the moment we would lay everything on the line for our daughter's sake. And as the principal greeted us with a warm smile, completely unaware of what was about to be revealed, I couldn't help but feel a cold chill of uncertainty. But there was no turning back now. We had to see this through, no matter what it took. For Eva's sake, we had to fight. The meeting with the principal was more unsettling than I had anticipated. As Emma and I laid out the evidence, recording after recording of Miss Campbell's relentless cruelty, I expected a surge of righteous indignation from the principal. But instead, we were met with a calculated calmness, a detached professionalism that only heightened my unease. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention," Principal Matthews said, her voice measured and cool. "This is certainly concerning, and we will launch a thorough investigation. However, I must remind you that these recordings, while troubling, are not the full picture. We need to understand the context." "Context?" Emma repeated, her voice incredulous. "How much context do you need to understand that our daughter is being emotionally abused? Listen to the way she talks to Eva. This isn't about discipline or maintaining order. It's about cruelty." Principal Matthews held up a hand, signaling for calm. "I'm not disputing your concerns, Mrs. Anderson, but we have a process to follow. We'll speak to Miss Campbell, review her side of the story, and take statements from the other staff and students. Meanwhile, our daughter is supposed to just keep going to school and face this woman every day." I interjected, my frustration bubbling over. "How can we trust that she won't continue to hurt Eva in the meantime?" "We can arrange for Eva to be placed in another classroom temporarily while the investigation is ongoing," Principal Matthews suggested. "But I must ask you to refrain from discussing this matter with other parents until we have all the facts." Emma and I exchanged a glance. It was clear that the school was more concerned with covering its tracks than with addressing the immediate harm being done to our daughter. I felt a surge of anger, but I knew pushing too hard might backfire. We needed the school on our side, even if their approach felt inadequate. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "But know this, we are not going to let this slide. We'll be following up every step of the way." Principal Matthews nodded, her expression inscrutable. "We'll be in touch." As we left the school, the tension between Emma and me was palpable. I could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface, matching my own. But there was something else gnawing at me, something I couldn't shake. The cold professionalism of the principal, the way she seemed almost unfazed by the severity of the recordings, it all felt too familiar. As we drove home, the silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken fears and doubts. Finally, Emma broke the silence, her voice tight with frustration. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" she asked, staring straight ahead at the road. "Or are they just going to sweep this under the rug?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know. But we can't just rely on them. We need to figure out why Miss Campbell is doing this. There's something more going on here." Emma glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure of how to explain the strange sense of familiarity that had been haunting me. "I think I knew Miss Campbell when I was in kindergarten," I admitted slowly. "I didn't realize it at first, but the more I think about it, the more certain I am. She was my teacher too." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious? You never mentioned that before." "I didn't remember until now," I said, shaking my head. "It was so long ago, and she was new back then. But there's something about the way she treated me. It wasn't as blatant as what she's doing to Eva, but there was this coldness, this disapproval. I always felt like I couldn't do anything right in her eyes." Emma looked at me, her concern deepening. "Do you think that's why she's targeting Eva? Because she remembers you?" "I don't know," I replied, the uncertainty gnawing at me. "But it's too much of a coincidence to ignore. Maybe it's not about Eva at all. Maybe it's about me." Emma frowned, processing this new information. "But why? What could you have possibly done as a kid that would make her hold a grudge all these years?" I shrugged helplessly. "I have no idea, but I'm going to find out." That night, after putting Eva to bed, I sat down with an old box of memories I hadn't touched in years. Inside were faded photographs, old report cards, and other mementos from my childhood. I sifted through them slowly, searching for anything that might jog my memory about Miss Campbell. As I sorted through the papers, a particular photograph caught my eye. It was a class picture from kindergarten, the children lined up in neat rows, smiling awkwardly at the camera. In the background stood Miss Campbell, her expression stern even then, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera's lens. My heart skipped a beat as I studied her face. She looked younger, of course, but there was no mistaking the same coldness in her eyes, the same tight-lipped expression that I had come to know through the recordings. And standing directly in front of her, almost as if she were looming over me, was a younger version of myself. A small boy with a nervous smile, trying to blend into the background. "Here," I said, handing the photograph to Emma. "That's her. And that's me." Emma took the photograph, her eyes widening as she studied it. "It's definitely her," she said quietly. "But what does this mean?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm going to figure it out. There has to be a reason why she's doing this, why she's targeting Eva. I just need to remember." As the night wore on, I found myself replaying old memories in my mind, searching for any clue that might explain Miss Campbell's behavior. But the more I tried to recall, the more elusive the memories became. I could remember the classroom, the other children, the routine of the school day, but Miss Campbell herself was a shadow, a figure on the periphery of my childhood. And then, just as I was about to give up, a memory surfaced, clearer than the rest, vivid in its intensity. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that made the classroom feel darker and more oppressive than usual. We were supposed to be working on an art project, drawing pictures of our families. I had drawn my parents and me stand in front of our house, with big, bright smiles on our faces. I was proud of my drawing. It was the best I had ever done. But when Miss Campbell came around to check our work, she stopped in front of my desk, her eyes narrowing as she looked at my drawing. I had expected praise, or at least a nod of approval, but instead, she had picked up my drawing and frowned. "This isn't very good," she had said, her voice cold and dismissive. "You can do better than this, can't you?" I remember feeling a rush of shame, the pride I had felt just moments before crumbling to dust. I had looked up at her, my eyes wide with confusion. But I tried really hard, I had said, my voice barely above a whisper. Miss Campbell had sighed, shaking her head. "Trying isn't enough," she had replied, echoing the same words she had used with Eva so many years later. "If this is the best you can do, then you're never going to get anywhere in life." The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. The sense of inadequacy, the shame that had washed over me in that moment, was as fresh now as it had been back then. I had never forgotten the way she made me feel, though I hadn't realized it until now. I turned to Emma, my voice trembling with the weight of the realization. "She's always been like this," I said, the words catching in my throat. "She did it to me, and now she's doing it to Eva. But why? Why would she hold on to something from so long ago?" Emma looked at me, her expression a mix of sympathy and determination. "Maybe it's not about you specifically," she suggested. "Maybe she just targets certain kids who remind her of something she doesn't like. Maybe it's about control, about feeling powerful by making others feel small." I nodded slowly, trying to make sense of it all. But that doesn't explain why she's still here, still doing this after all these years. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? Emma frowned, deep in thought. "Maybe she's been good at hiding it," she said. "Or maybe the school has been protecting her for some reason. We need to dig deeper. There has to be more to this." As I sat there, staring at the old photograph, I knew she was right. This wasn't just about Miss Campbell's cruelty, it was about something much bigger, something that had been festering for years, unnoticed and unchecked. And as much as I wanted to protect Eva, I knew that to truly keep her safe, I had to confront the past, to uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything I could about Miss Campbell, her history, her connections, anything that might explain why she had become the way she was. And if the school wasn't going to help us, then we would find another way to get to the truth. "Where do we start?" Emma asked, her voice steady as she prepared herself for the battle ahead. With her past, I replied, a new resolve hardening in my chest. There has to be someone who knows more about her, someone who can tell us what we're dealing with. We need to find out who she really is and why she's doing this to our daughter. And with that, we set out on a path that would lead us deep into the shadows of Miss Campbell's life, uncovering secrets that would change everything we thought we knew about her and about ourselves. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves as I walked to my car. The unease that had settled in my chest the night before hadn't dissipated, but it had morphed into something else, resolve. I couldn't let this go, not when Ava's happiness and well-being were at stake. The encounter with Principal Matthews had left a bitter taste in my mouth, and I knew that relying solely on the school to protect my daughter was no longer an option. As I drove toward the school, my mind raced with thoughts of Miss Campbell and the tangled web of memories that had resurfaced. The old photograph, the haunting recollection of her words from my childhood, and the way she had singled out Ava, it all pointed to something deeper, something that I had to understand if I wanted to protect my little girl. But where to begin? Miss Campbell had been an enigma back then, and she was even more of a mystery now. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed to start digging into her past, to find out who she really was and what had driven her to become the person she was today. The idea of confronting her directly filled me with a mix of dread and determination. I didn't know how she would react, but I couldn't avoid this any longer. It was time to take matters into my own hands. After dropping Eva off at school, I decided to pay a visit to the local library. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I hoped to find some old yearbooks, school records, or even newspaper articles that might shed light on Miss Campbell's history. If she had been teaching for as long as I suspected, there had to be some record of her career, something that could give me insight into her motivations. The library was quiet, the only sound being the soft rustle of pages and the occasional murmur of conversation. I made my way to the reference section, scanning the shelves for anything that might be useful. After a few minutes of searching, I found a section dedicated to local history, including old yearbooks from the various schools in the area. I pulled out a yearbook from the year I had been in kindergarten, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped through the pages. The photographs were faded, the faces of the children and teachers captured in a sepia-toned world that seemed so distant now. I found my class photo, the same one I had seen the night before, and there she was, Miss Campbell, standing behind me with that same cold expression. But there was more. As I continued to flip through the pages, I found other photographs of her at school events with other teachers, always on the periphery, always slightly removed from the warmth and camaraderie of the others. There was something in her eyes, a kind of sadness or bitterness that I hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, but it was there. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see an older librarian, her kind eyes studying me with a hint of curiosity. Yes, I said, clearing my throat. "I'm looking for information on one of the teachers from when I was in kindergarten, Miss Campbell. Do you know if there's any more information about her here?" The librarian's expression shifted slightly, her brow furrowing in thought. "Miss Campbell, you say?" "I think I remember her. She's been teaching here for a very long time. Quiet, kept to herself mostly. Never married, as far as I know. Is there something specific you're looking for?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "She's my daughter's teacher now, and, well, I have some concerns." I was hoping to learn more about her background. The librarian nodded slowly, as if considering my words. "I see. Well, there's not much more in the yearbooks, but I can check if we have any old newspaper clippings or other records in the archives. Sometimes teachers were featured in articles, especially if they were involved in the community." "That would be great," I said, grateful for her help. "Anything you can find would be useful." The librarian led me to a small room at the back of the library, filled with old filing cabinets and boxes of records. The smell of dust and aging paper filled the air as she began to sift through the files. "You know," she said as she worked, "it's interesting that you're asking about Miss Campbell. I've always thought there was something unusual about her. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but she never seemed to connect with the other teachers, or even the students. She was always very strict, but never outright unkind, not that I knew of anyway." "Did she ever talk about her past?" I asked, leaning against one of the cabinets. "Her family, where she came from." The librarian shook her head. Not that I recall, she was very private. But I do remember hearing something, a rumor really, about a tragedy in her family when she was young. I don't know the details, but it seemed to affect her deeply. Perhaps that's why she kept to herself. A tragedy? That piqued my interest. Could that be the key to understanding her behavior? The librarian continued to search through the records until she finally pulled out a thin folder. Here we are, she said, handing it to me. It's not much, just a couple of articles mentioning her and an old staff directory. Maybe there's something in there that will help. I took the folder and sat down at one of the nearby tables, my heart pounding with anticipation. The first article was from several decades ago, a brief mention of Miss Campbell when she first started teaching. It didn't reveal much, just a standard piece about the new staff at the school. The second article, however, was more intriguing. It was dated shortly after she began her teaching career, and it referenced a tragedy that had struck her family. According to the article, Miss Campbell's younger sister had died in a car accident when they were both children. The details were vague, but it was clear that the loss had been devastating for her and her family. The article mentioned that Miss Campbell had been deeply affected by the loss, withdrawing from her friends and becoming more isolated. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Could this tragedy have shaped the person she had become? Could it explain the coldness, the need for control, the way she seemed to target children who reminded her of something she had lost? It was a stretch, but it made a certain kind of sense. I decided to take the next step. I needed to confront Miss Campbell, not just as a parent, but as someone who had once been her student. Maybe, just maybe, I could get her to open up, to understand why she was doing this to Eva. It was a risk, but one I was willing to take for my daughter. The next day, I arrived at the school just before the end of the day. I waited near the entrance, watching as the children streamed out of the building, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Finally, I saw Miss Campbell exit the building, her face set in that familiar expression of sternness. "Miss Campbell," I called out, walking toward her. She stopped, turning to face me with a look of mild surprise. "Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice as cold as ever. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to talk to you," I said, keeping my tone steady, "about Eva." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her features. "Is there something wrong?" "Yes, there is," I said, not mincing words. "Eva is terrified of coming to school because of the way you treat her. I've heard the things you've said to her, the way you belittle and frighten her. This has to stop." For a moment, Miss Campbell said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, a long, weary exhale that seemed to carry the weight of years. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness. "You think I'm being cruel, but it's not like that. I'm trying to prepare her, to make her strong. By breaking her down," I demanded, anger rising in my chest, "by making her feel worthless." Miss Campbell's gaze hardened. "Life is hard, Mr. Anderson. Children need to learn that early, or they'll be crushed by it later. I know what happens when you're not prepared, when you're too soft. I won't let that happen to Eva." Her words struck a chord, and I realized that she truly believed what she was saying. But it was wrong, so terribly wrong. "What happened to you?" I said, more gently now. "It doesn't have to happen to her. Eva is just a child. She needs kindness, not harshness. She needs to feel safe, not scared." For the first time, I saw something crack in Miss Campbell's facade. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked away, as if struggling with something deep inside. "I lost my sister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was soft, trusting, and it destroyed her. I swore I would never be like that. I swore I would never let anyone else suffer like she did. I took a step closer, my voice calm but firm. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you're not protecting Eva by treating her this way. You're hurting her just like you were hurt, and it has to stop." Miss Campbell didn't respond immediately, her eyes distant as if she were reliving memories she had buried long ago. Finally, she nodded, a slow, reluctant gesture. "I'll think about what you've said," she murmured, her voice heavy with the weight of her own pain. "But I can't promise anything." "That's all I ask," I said, though I knew it wasn't enough. But it was a start. As I walked away, a part of me felt relief that I had confronted her, that I had finally spoken out. But another part of me knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Miss Campbell was deeply entrenched in her beliefs, shaped by a tragedy that had left her scarred. It would take more than words to change her, to protect Ava from the damage she could still cause. But I was ready. Whatever it took, I would keep my daughter safe. This was a battle I was prepared to fight to the end, and I wouldn't back down. For Ava's sake, and for the sake of the other children who might suffer under Miss Campbell's harsh hand, I would find a way to end this. And if that meant uncovering more of the past, digging deeper into the wounds that had made Miss Campbell who she was, then so be it. A father's resolve is a powerful thing, and mine was now stronger than ever.